All right, so tonight we're starting Rome. You can see just with the kind of outline here, we're going to cover a whole lot of time very quickly in about the next hour or so, from the rise of the earliest Italian civilizations around the year 2000 BCE or so, and we're going to try to launch up almost to year zero. So we're going to cover, give or take, 2,000 years, which is skipping through a whole lot of detail. But we're going to talk about what ancient Italy looks like geographically, as we do with other civilizations in this class, and kind of socially with different cultures. So this is a map of Italy. And much like Greece, Italy has a lot of mountains, not a ton of good farmland comparatively. So ancient Italy has a lot of the same struggles that ancient Greece did. The civilizations that grow up in this area, they often can't access enough food just in Italy itself because there's so many rocks in the soil because of all these mountains. The civilizations are divided up. They're separated by mountain ranges, so for a long time they don't contact each other very much, so they don't build much unity. I mean, they view each other as enemies and they fight each other quite a lot. And the civilizations will pop up in areas that have some farmland but are often surrounded by swamps and whatnot. So they will kind of develop in isolation from each other. And there's just a lack of resources all around. So they develop great rivalries with each other, which will kind of lead into their political history. Italy's best natural ports tend to be on the western side of the peninsula. So going back real quick to the map of the mountains, there's this giant mountain range that basically runs like a spinal cord right down central Italy and really divides Italy land-wise, geographically, into a west side and an east side of the mountains. And most of the really good natural ports are on the west side. So the early large cities that will develop are largely on the western coastline of the peninsula. And that has big political ramifications, big political results, because they're growing up on the other side of the mountains, not facing Greece. And the Greeks are becoming the kind of center of civilization and power around the 2000 and going into the 1000s BCE. And they have a more difficult time getting around Sicily, this island here, and up into western Italy. So some of these civilizations can develop for a little while without being invaded by the Greeks for a while, for a few hundred years. And there will be 4 different major civilizations that pop up in Italy. And they will fight each other pretty dramatically for a long time. The first one are called the Etruscans on this map, to the north in green. On this map, their land is called Etruria. But the textbooks will call them the Etruscans. They are the first real dominant power in Italy. They are not a unified government. They're kind of like a confederation of many different tribes of people. They build small cities all over the place. Sometimes they argue with each other. So there's not a whole lot of unity amongst the Etruscans. Largely the only thing they can agree on is that they don't like other people in Italy. But they share a similar type of culture and language. And they eventually, over time, build up trade, which makes them a lot of money. They trade with outside groups. And they become rich in the north, and they start building up militaries and trying to exert their influence over their neighbors. Another group, a little bit further to the south, call themselves the Latins. And that is their language for flatland. Basically, they're the flatlanders. They live around fairly good farmland. You can see they're not nearly as large as the Etruscans territorially on this map. So they feel more vulnerable to attack especially from the north. And the third major group are actually the Greeks, who come in and start colonizing largely this island to the south, Sicily, and then they start slowly making their way up the Italian peninsula while they're colonizing a whole lot of other areas in the Mediterranean Sea. So the Greeks make themselves into an Italian type of force just through colonization, just invasion, conquest, and building up Greek cities on foreign lands. Does that make sense? So they're another one of the big kind of major players for power in Italy. And the fourth one is much further north beyond the mountain range. On this map, they're called the Gauls. Different textbooks will call them different things, different labels. But basically, the Etruscans and the Latins and even the Greeks considered these people to the far north to be so culturally different from the Etruscans or the Latins that they're not even really considered Italians. Does that make sense? They're way out there. They're like northerners who speak a totally different language and have different social customs. But today, that area's parts of it, at least, are part of modern-day Italy. So it kind of goes into the textbooks as one of the four civilizations of modern-day Italy. Does that make sense? Questions about any of the four?
Isn't the Etruscan or whatever? Aren't they like a league?
Oh, what?
I've read them before, and it's like called the Etruscan League.
Oh yeah.
Is that like a special?
It's their group for military defense.
So,
It's kind of like in the early United States, you had 13 different states, right? 13 colonies became 13 states. And they're all self-governing. They're like their own little countries.
Confederacy.
And they band together in a confederacy to raise like a mutual army so they don't get invaded. That doesn't mean that they agree with each other all the time. They have their own separate laws, and that's how the Etruscan cities function. And the Romans, the Latins, will eventually do the same thing. They'll build up a federation of different Italian cities for mutual self-defense, even though a lot of times they don't even really trust each other all that much. Does that make sense? And the Etruscans are especially famous in, if you ever take art history classes, they develop an extraordinary artistic movement, statues and paintings and all kinds of things. It's pretty amazing what they do in their relatively short amount of time and dominance in northern Italy. Yeah. But to go to another map real quick, we've seen this before when we've talked about the Greek colonization. So Greece starts off way out here in the kind of eastern Mediterranean, but when their cities get overpopulated, they start sending armies out to conquer other areas around the whole sea, around the whole coastline. And they basically build Greek cities on a Greek model just all over the place. And when the Greeks start doing that, this is when they go into Sicily and they start moving up the Italian peninsula. But to the Greeks, this is just one of many places that they're conquering and setting up shop. Does that make sense? So these histories kind of become intertwined. And it's hard for them to kind of break apart from each other. And when the Greeks start arriving in southern Italy, they try to start dominating all the trade routes, and they start kind of competing with the Etruscans for business, for money. And since the Greeks go in, and at least some cities go in a pretty organized way and start building up major Greek cities, they're kind of advertising themselves as good places for ships to stop, and they're taking a lot of customers from the Etruscans. And the Etruscans don't like that, and they fight each other out in the sea, and they start fighting each other on land. So the big wars for hundreds of years will be between the Etruscans and the Greeks over dominance over Italy. And if you look at kind of the map of the whole Mediterranean Sea, military theorists still talk about it today. Whoever controls kind of southern Italy and Sicily has a major impact on all the other trade routes because it's right there smack in the middle. If you control that area, you can push other people around. Does that make sense? And if you're starting out from, say, modern-day Spain, and you want to go to modern-day Greece, Sicily is a good kind of stopping point. It's a rest point. So it's a central place to control if you want to influence the whole rest of the waterway. And this is big, big business. I mean, this is like the biggest business of the time. This is how people are getting really, really rich. So whoever controls these areas will have access to that money and tax it and, enrich their civilization. Does that make sense? So the Etruscans and the Greeks will fight it out for quite a long time, for hundreds of years. And the Latins really try to stay out of it as much as possible, because the Greeks and the Etruscans are the two superpowers of Italy, and they're just going at each other constantly. War after war after war. There's like intermediary peace treaties and whatnot that stop the fighting for a little while. But it's really just a matter of time before the Etruscans and the Greeks go at it again. So it's just constant warfare against each other. And the Latins do a pretty smart thing. They stay out of it because they're weaker and smaller. And the Latins basically say, why not let our two larger enemies destroy each other? And that's pretty much what the Etruscans and the Greeks do. The Greeks, over the long term, gain the upper hand over the Etruscans. So the Etruscans are the big losers of the war. But the wars over centuries tend to damage the Greek cities also to the point that it weakens the Greeks over time. Does that make sense? And over hundreds of years, it really changes the relationship between the Latins and kind of collapse the Etruscans in the north, and then the Greeks that are even weakened themselves. But when the Greeks continue moving up the peninsula, the big Greek city that gets founded, that gets built, is today called Naples. The original Greek word was Neapolis. And when the Greeks found Neapolis in 750s BCE, that scares the Latins, because the Latins start feeling that the Greeks are kind of marching north up the coastline, and they're getting closer and closer to the Latin areas. So in order to consolidate power in their holdings, the Latins build their own big city, which they call Rome. And they build it right on the mouth of the Tiber River, right where it kind of gets close enough to the sea. Rome is not really a great spot. It's a place where the river meets the ocean, so there's all kinds of estuaries and whatnot, and it's kind of swampy in some places. So Rome is not a strategically great place, and they have to build a series of bridges to get from one piece of land to another. Early Rome is basically a series of hilltops overlooking all this gigantic river system that has all these winding areas. And they have to build bridges to connect the hilltops. And that's what the original city was. But they're building it in order to bring together as much power, as many soldiers, and kind of unified government as they possibly can, just in case the Greeks invade their territory and they have to fight back. Does that make sense? So that's when the Latins kind of build at least the first phase of Rome. Rome will have many phases, and it grows pretty dramatically as the Latins' power grows. So questions about this at all? Nope. All right. And all right, just moving on. All right. So Rome is built in the 750s in direct just reaction to feeling threatened. The early Roman government is said to have been run by kings. It's a monarchy, which is frequently a thing that people do when they want to centralize power. It's like hard to centralize power in a city council or something because there's no head decision maker. Does that make sense? To deal with a crisis or something. So, early Rome is a monarchy, and eventually it will have 7 kings, one after another, that stay on the throne for about 250 years, going into the 500s, and start having problems and revolts and whatnot. But it's not just a monarchy. They do create a kind of city council type thing that they call the Senate. And usually senators are appointed to be overseers of the Roman government, and largely to keep the royal family in line, to keep them from getting too aggressive against the people and too oppressive. Does that make sense? So there's these kind of legendary 7 kings that historians have difficulty finding written sources about them. And a lot of the myths, the stories don't seem very kind of reliable. And a couple of the kings have names that sound like they're more Etruscan than Latin, so there's a lot of historians who kind of wonder why that would be. Did they import a royal monarch from the Etruscan Empire, or did they just feel it so necessary to have good relations with the Etruscans that they just kind of named their king from the Etruscan language? It's still being debated today. So this is where the Roman government starts, and this idea of the Senate starts. And the Senate was supposed to be a pretty respectable type body. It was like seen as the defense of the people, upholding the morality and the honesty of government for the benefit of the average people, the working people. The problem is that the biggest landowning families become senators, so whether or not they're going to protect the average working people is a whole other problem. All right, going to the next section. The Romans decide to drain their swamplands in the late 500s. And this is a major statement of where Rome is at this point. I like this image. This is a modern day photograph because it shows you these kind of lowlands, but you can also see the hills in the background, right? And the hills were the original areas of Rome. All the land, the lower level land, the lowlands that you see in this picture, that was all swamp in the first Rome, the first phase of the city. So the Romans, by the late 500s, are feeling confident enough that they can somehow drain the swamp and expand the amount of kind of exposed land that they can build their city on. Does that make sense?
Does it say how they did?
Say again?
Do they say how they did it?
Yeah, there's a lot of sources on it, and it's technologically difficult, number one, to drain a swamp even today, and back then they're doing it with basically shovels and buckets. So it's a massive amount of labor, which means a massive amount of government spending to get the job done.
Did they have slaves?
They had slaves, but it appears that a lot of the workers were paid wage laborers. So the very fact that they would try this and accomplish it tells us some important things about Rome at this point, around the year 500 BCE. Number one, they have some amount of technological advancement. So the government is starting to kind of reorient its focus and invest in the technology of their time to figure out how to move the water and where to put it and how to basically start laying concrete down on top of the old swamp in order to kind of solidify the land and make it useful. So that's one big thing about Rome, and they'll keep investing in higher and higher levels of technology as a government down through the years, which is one of their great sources of power. Another thing is that the Roman government had the money to spend, which means that their society is pretty prosperous. They have a good running economy. Because you really have to have a well-running economy that the government can tax to get the revenue to do something on this scale. Does it make sense? You have to have good economic growth and a pretty prosperous people in order to get enough money to build giant roads or drain a swamp or whatever giant infrastructure project you want to build. It's tough to do that in a poor community because the government just doesn't have access to the money. Does it make sense? So its economic growth is really phenomenal at this point, largely because the Etruscans and the Greeks have damaged each other so badly that now the Latins can expand and start getting access to more trade, more money, more business. And when you look at just the scale of what they built, even in the first what are called forums, it's built as an outdoor mall, basically. So these are just the ruins, but you can see these are large buildings. If you look at like these two little blips here, you see those little dark spots? Those are people. So this is on a very large scale, and some of these buildings would have been very, very tall, built out of stone, and you have to engineer that and gain the resources and the expertise to build something like that. And these tall buildings would have been like virtually everywhere. And you have these little avenues and alleyways between the buildings that you can still see in the ruins. And the fact that they built this to be a kind of large outdoor mall and these buildings house shops where you can go buy things also shows their economic focus. They are a commercially oriented society. Their society is largely built around buying and selling things, what we today call like international business and entrepreneurship. Does that make sense? So they didn't, drain the swamps and build like a giant military barracks to house soldiers or anything like that. They built a giant mall, which tells you what the government thought was most important. Does that make sense? Or what they thought was most necessary, what was most needed for their society. And when they build the original forum, the Latins just kind of go there because, just like today, it's like a meeting place. It's where people go to kind of interact and, back in their time, see plays instead of today you go to malls and see movies. But these are places where you could go to eat and shop and be entertained. And so these are become kind of population centers. Does that make sense? And just like today also, politicians start to understand that if they want to gain popularity, a mall is a good place to go to talk to a lot of people all in one shot, in one day. Does that make sense? Usually politicians don't go out to the middle of the forest or the middle of the desert or something to talk to people to try to get elected or to gain popularity. They go to big population centers so they can talk to as many people at the same time as they possibly can to spread their message far and wide. Does that make sense? And so many Latin politicians went into the forums that eventually they start rededicating buildings and they start building little amphitheaters for public speakers to come up and address the people, address the shoppers. So they'll start to alter their city in ways to make it more accessible for politics. So that again shows what the government was focused on, what it thought was important for the people to have access to, and how the people were using the space. Does that make sense? So technology, economics, politics, these are all kind of merging in importance as the second phase of Rome is built with the draining of these swamps around the year 500 BCE. So questions about any of that? And it's done on a massive scale. And this is just the first phase, or I guess the second phase. Rome will continue growing and be built into a gigantic metropolis over the years. And interestingly, right when they're building this kind of economic political system in their city, there's a big revolution of the people. People get sick of the last of the kings. And there's an uprising that overthrows that king, overthrows the monarchy, and builds a new government, or at least demands a new government. So the monarchy is out, but the kind of city council, the Senate, is still controlled by the big landowners. And just like today, the big rich families, the big rich people, don't really want to trust the uprising of the working class. Because usually the working class doesn't like the rich very much, if you're familiar with this. Yeah. So that's usually why they get so pissed off. They feel oppressed and there's no opportunity for them. The rich are just taking it all for themselves. Sound familiar? So the Senate gets worried because they are the big landowning families. They get their nephews and whatnot into the Senate. So the Senate, they're kind of negotiating with the leaders of this uprising about what this new government's going to look like. And it will become known as a republic, which means kind of democracy, on some level at least. And republic also implies that everybody is legally equal, that you have to follow the law no matter how rich you are or how poor you are. The law is applied equally and kind of blindly amongst the population. It doesn't care about your background or where you're from. If you break the law, you have to, pay this fine or go to jail or whatever for this amount of time. It doesn't matter who you are or where you come from. So that's largely what a republic means also. But the Senate, they're looking to protect as much land and power for themselves as they possibly can. And the senators are really afraid of a revolutionary leader like gaining control of the government and setting himself up as a new king or a new dictator. So the senators figure out in negotiating how to get special laws put into place to help govern this new government. And we'll talk about a couple of them in a minute. But society really starts to break down into two different major groups. First are the patricians, and they are basically the wealthy, the landowning nobility. The people who have what we today call institutional wealth. Big families that have so much land that usually the family members don't really have to work very hard. They're just kind of born into wealth, and they may gain a real big education or maybe write books or give speeches or something like that. But a lot of time they've never been a farmer themselves. They've never gone out and planted a tree or harvested the crop or anything like that. They don't do the average kind of normal labor that most workers out there do on a daily basis. So they are known as the patricians. And everyone else are called plebeians. So there's, most people in society are just farmers. Either working for a patrician landowner or maybe just have their own little farm somewhere. Does that make sense? Just like most of us are wage workers. We go to work every day and we get paid a certain amount of money, per hour or per year or whatever. All right? And we work for wealthier business owners or families or something like that. Does that sound familiar to you?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. The differences in society, basically the patricians try to figure out every possible move they can to keep control and keep wealth in their own hands as much as possible. So they develop what historians and sociologists call a patronage system, which comes right out of the word patrician. It basically means that if you are an average kind of commoner out there, you probably on some level work for one of these bigger, more wealthy families. Either as an employee, making wages, getting paid money for labor, or in relationship to the family somehow. So they may buy you a house as long as you keep working for the family. Does that make sense? So they may not pay you money all the time for your work, but they've given you something of great value, which puts you in a real bind if you're the worker. Can you really criticize your boss anymore if they're like co-owner of your house with you? No, because they just kick you out. Does that make sense? Or for people that really need that monthly income, that money, in order to feed their families, just to survive, are you very critical of the boss? Or are you openly critical of the boss? Do you go to the boss and say, you're screwing this up, you're an idiot, you can't keep doing this? No, because they'll fire you and now you're unemployed and you might starve to death. So a lot of the working and kind of poor people amongst the Latins, and especially in Rome, they get a lot of protection either through money or some other means from the rich, from the patricians, but they also have to kind of do what they say. Does that sound familiar to you at least? Yep. Okay. And it gets even uglier than that as Roman history goes forward. But you have these pretty dramatic, and it's pretty obvious who is the rich and who is everybody else. It's not tough to analyze. The rich are living nice, opulent lives, and the workers are out there working every day. The problem, though, is that by law, the patricians were the only ones who could serve in government positions. You have to be from one of those families to be in the government bureaucracy. And that causes gigantic problems for the long term of the government, because basically, if you have a legal separation of people into one group or the other, a rich group and a poor group, that might start off fairly well, but over the years, some of these rich families go bankrupt, right? They don't always stay rich, every single one of them. Because if you've ever met a person who's born into a rich family, say if you know them as a college student, do they tend to work real hard and study hard and do everything they can to learn as much as they can?
No.
Not usually. Why is that?
I don't feel like they have to.
Yeah, they're from a rich family. They know they're going to be taken care of, or they believe they're going to be taken care of. So, I mean, I ran into many of these people where they're just kind of showing up to class, they're not, something to do to impress their parents or their uncles or someone, so they don't get kicked out of the household. But they're just kind of going through the motions. They're not really dedicated, because they know they don't have to work hard. But what happens when they get older, into their 40s or 50s or 60s, and their parents' generation kind of dies off, and now this person who's never really had to work very hard is suddenly running the business? What happens to that business? Yeah, it can go down pretty fast, because that person's never really had responsibility before and maybe doesn't really know what they're doing. So some of these patrician families, even today, go downhill pretty quick when they kind of get a lazy jackass in charge of the place. Does that make sense? So some patrician families actually go bankrupt over time. But because of this law that says that only these families can serve in government, even if they go bankrupt and they become poor, they're still in the government. And other families that are not patrician, if you get someone who works really hard when they're young, they build a business. They're from a plebeian family, but they get rich. Does that make sense? Happens every once in a while. But because they're from a plebeian family, they cannot be in government. Does that make sense? So over generations, over many years, you start getting a disconnect between who is rich and who's running the place. Does that make sense? It's a little theoretical, but I mean, it's a major problem for the long term. The really wealthy, powerful people often are not the ones running government, which opens the people who are running government up to bribery because they need money. Another major problem is that, especially early on, the patricians run the government, but they are like the wealthy 1%, right? They don't have enough people in their group to defend the city, to build an army. So when it comes down to war, and if Rome is going to be invaded, the patrician-led government often tries to build an army out of the plebeians, which is not easy to do frequently. And why is that? What's the number one question that the plebeians ask when they're told to go to war and fight?
Why?
Yeah, what the hell am I fighting for? To defend your power? Screw you. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah, why join the army if it's not your family that's going to make money off of it? Does it make sense? And the plebeians look around and say, well, wait a minute, how many of these patrician kids are joining the army to go off and fight? Like in the United States today, how many kids from wealthy families go into the military?
Well, they go officer. Because they can
Well,
afford to put
a lot of them don't even go in the first place because they don't have to. They're rich. They think they're going to be taken care of forever. Unless they feel it's like a national emergency or something, or they really want to like do something with their lives in the world, right? There's some who go into the military, but a whole lot of them say, not me, that's a poor person's job. Does that make sense? So, I still ask that question today. How is it that these rich families, even the United States, how do they go to the poor and say, we need soldiers. Come join our war and we're going to send you out to fight. What are they fighting for? But the plebeians back in Rome asked the same question. And when the patrician-led government would go to war, a lot of times the plebeians would refuse to fight. Does it make sense? Say, we're not going to go fight unless you change these government laws, unless we get something out of it. If you make changes to the government that will kind of empower us or give us something that we demand, then we'll go off and fight. But a lot of the soldiers just kind of go on strike for a while. And how effective do you think that is? Well, it's extremely effective. The rich people don't want to go out and fight themselves, and they have to give in to plebeian demands over and over and over again for really a couple hundred years, from about 500 down to 300 BCE. And you get a kind of evolution of the Roman government that gives more power and more rights and more opportunities to the plebeians. Does that make sense? Because they're threatening to go on strike militarily.
How do they know you're plebeian?
How do you know if you're a plebeian? Huh?
Noise or,
How do you know if you're a plebeian?
yeah, like,
A lot of times it's legally defined.
come on, Nazi Germany. You we the star.
Or even like Britain today. They have a legally accepted aristocracy of landed nobles who get a vote in their Congress,
The House of Lords.
yeah, just because of the family they're born into. They get a vote. They don't have to run for election. They're Duke of wherever the hell. And they get a vote in the government. It's still there. So we don't even have to look back into history. Just look at what's going on right now. And they still have a monarchy, don't they?
Well, a symbolic monarchy.
A monarchy that is symbolic by choice.
I think in most of
Yeah.
Europe.
But they can take over the government whenever they want. The monarchy right now in Britain just allows the elected representatives to govern the place. But the Queen can come back any day she feels like, and I'm back in power and I'm running this place. So, but The aristocracy, this patrician definition is still legal in some places, and not just Britain, but other places throughout the world, even today. So yeah. And a lot of the commoners in Britain, I don't want to say a lot of them, but some of them, they don't like it. And they've complained about it, and they want to get changes made, but it's hard to get legal changes made when those rich people have a vote just by birth, right? How are you going to convince them to change a system that favors them? They don't want it. Just like the patricians didn't back then, but the plebeians were smart enough to go on strike, so they can basically blackmail the rich to get what they want. The biggest change that they get is in 287, a change in the law that creates what is known as the plebiscite. And that is basically a democratic vote. The plebiscite says that the plebeians get to vote for their lawmakers. Not all plebeians. You have to be an adult male. So there's a lot of sexism in Rome, and there's a lot of slavery in Rome also. So women and certain ethnic minorities and slaves, they don't get a vote. But adult men get a vote. And that is a kind of revolutionary idea in Rome. This is a big, big change. The city's been there almost 500 years by this point. Does it make sense? So questions about what the plebiscite means?
So by this time, do they control a large amount of territory, or is it just Latin?
They're growing, but not to the extent that they will. Yeah, they're growing in Italy because the Etruscans and the Greeks have been so harmed that the Latins have like this opportunity to increase their territory, and they're going to do so. We'll talk about kind of piece by piece how they do that after we get through all these legal things. Yeah. Other questions? No? All right. The patricians, they grant the plebeians a voting right, but the patricians still want to stay in control, as wealthy people usually do. They'll offer a compromise, but try to water it down as much as they can so they still control the government for themselves in the long term. The patricians are really afraid that at some point a plebeian politician is going to become so popular that they just kind of take over the whole city, and they're going to kick out all the patricians and set up like some kind of plebeian dictatorship. So the patricians get new laws passed to limit the authority of any one politician in Rome. And we'll go through a few of examples of how they do this. Number one, any lawmaker only gets a one-year term in office. So if you win the election in, say, the year 2016, you are a lawmaker in the Senate for 2017, and then at the end of that year, there's going to be another election, but you as the sitting lawmaker cannot run for re-election. You have to wait at least 1 year. So you can run for office in 2016. If you're elected, you serve in 2017, but you can't run for re-election in 2017, so you have to take the next year off, basically. And you can run for re-election in 2018. Does that make sense? And they did that to try to make sure that no lawmaker gets reelected over and over and over and over and over again so many times that it's just like expected that he's going to be there, and then he can try to build up kind of political groups to propel himself to take over the whole government. Another one is that the executive power, the law enforcers, the administration is divided between two different what were called consuls. So you don't just have kind of one king or one president enforcing the laws and collecting the tax money and overseeing the building of bridges and whatnot. You have two consuls that kind of have to work together. Because the patricians are afraid that if you have only one leader, one enforcer, one consul, he has control over all the armies, then he can kind of mobilize the armies and take over the whole city. If you have two, then like one might try to do it, but the other one will stop him out of fear. Does it make sense? Out of fear for himself. And the third is that it is illegal for either of the two consuls to bring the Roman army into the city, into Rome. The armies have to stay outside of the city.
But aren't they the army? Like, what do you mean?
The armies are not allowed to enter the city limits. They have to stay outside. Because the patricians are afraid if you invite the armies in, then they could just take over all the government buildings and throw the patricians all in jail and take over the government. Does it make sense? So they want to keep the soldiers out. And this is a rule in Rome for a long, long time. This has staying power. It stays around for a long time. But on very special occasions, when the Roman armies have won like a great glorious victory, the legislators and the consuls will agree to suspend that law for one day so the soldiers can march through the city and be celebrated in a parade. But it's only one day. So this is, this doesn't happen often. This is like once every 10 years or something. So you might see this 4 or 5 times in your adult life. So it's extremely special circumstances.
Do they call something specific?
The triumph.
Do
say
they call
again?
it something specific to that thing, or
There's a specific term they use. I can't remember off the top of my head, though. Yeah.
Isn't it a triumph? Isn't like a Latin word for that?
Well, they'll often build like something like the Washington Monument, Washington D.C., where it's like a big building or a big symbolic structure, and they'll call it a triumphal arch or a triumphal statue or something like that. So not only do they march to the city that one day, but they'll build a statue or something, so it'll be remembered forever. But the idea is also that this one day is going to be so heavily advertised that the population is going to line the city streets, and they're all going to be aware that the army is marching through. So it's not like the army can just like try to take over the whole city, because the people are out in the streets. Does that make sense? And it works pretty well for quite a while to stop the government from being overthrown. But each of these three is going to be really important as we talk about how Rome develops, and eventually governments do get overthrown and corrupted and whatnot. So we'll talk about it more in the following weeks. But this is their governing system. Okay. And another important part of this is how the new democracy impacts the patronage system. Now, if you work for one of these families, and these families are all fighting each other for political power, now these families, they don't just run the government because they're senators for life or anything like that. Now they have to win elections. So if you're an employee of one of these families, if you're a farmer or a herdsman, or you're like a wagon puller, or you're selling the family stuff in a store, or any of those things, you work directly for the family. When it comes down to voting day, it's not exactly a secret ballot. So the family can find out who you voted for. And the family will usually run one of their nephews or sons or someone for office to try to win the election and gain a voice in the Senate. Does that make sense? So if you're working for one of these families, what happens if they find out that you voted for somebody else that's not a member of their family?
Fired.
They fire you. So they may pay you well, and they may give you a nice house or something like that, but when it comes down to these voting days, they demand that you support the family ballot, basically, the family slate of candidates. So the plebeians get a democracy, they get a vote, but in a lot of ways their vote is corrupted and controlled. And pretty quickly, the big landowning families suddenly are winning all the elections. And these families are basically their own political parties, too. And some of these families hire a lot of guards. So they build up their own little family militias. And some of these families get violent against each other. They attack each other like physically, and they kill each other. They assassinate each other. And many historians argue that this patronage system is the kind of beginning of the mafia system. Does that make sense? If you get attached into this family, it is often based off of the patriarch, the big guy on top, like the Godfather type. And his sons and whatnot are kind of high-level advisors within the family, and they run the family's business, but it's often involved in crime. They're often also involved in politics and legitimate businesses, buying and selling and importing and exporting and all these things. It's all wrapped up into one kind of group. Does that make sense? And what happens if you get involved with one of these mafia-type families and you start making deals with opposing businesses, or you start supporting someone from another family? What happens then?
You better hope they win.
Yeah. Or else you can get killed. Because they demand absolute loyalty. And it's often enforced with violence. And even when they don't have to enforce it with violence, another problem is if you're a member of one of these families, and it's not just like a nuclear family. A lot of times I can go join a family just by being an employee, and I get so wrapped up into their system that I can't really get out, right? I'm a member for life. And that brings my family members into their group. Does that make sense? So this is often kind of accused of where these kind of systems start. But if I'm involved with one of these families for 20 years, and suddenly I want to switch families and go to someone else because if this family's not doing well and I think they're going to get taken out in the long term, I want to go join another group. Sometimes they don't even have to kill you. They'll just advertise the fact that you are untrustworthy. So they'll fire you and kick you out. But any of the other 50 families in Rome may not hire you because you're untrustworthy. You have a bad reputation. Does that make sense? So they just might try to destroy your kind of character. Yeah, your credibility. And if you can't get another job, you and your family just might starve to death. So a lot of times they don't have to kill people. They just threaten them with slander, basically. Does that make sense? So it's like if you quit one job to take another, you might want to carefully think about how you quit that job, because if you just walk out one day and the previous employer can go to your next employer and say, well, look what this person did. You don't want them around your business. And when you have like secrets about violence that you are aware of and you can testify, it gets all the more difficult to extricate yourself, more dangerous. So a lot of people who get involved with these families, this becomes generational. And there's an absolute demand for loyalty. And you combine that with voting and democracy, there's like, eventually, it starts off with hundreds and hundreds of different landowning families that are kind of fighting each other for power. Eventually, it gets down to about 40 or 50, and they really control Rome politically. Even without having a monarchy. They just are so wealthy and they have studied how to control through this patronage system. They've corrupted the system and society so deeply that it's difficult to break down their control. Does that make sense? So they are like political parties, right? I mean, the two major dominant parties in the United States are who?
Democrats.
And Republicans. Yeah. So Democrats and Republicans and their party leaders have studied how to corrupt the bureaucracy, how to get your people in for the long term. And they're very good at it. So it's almost kind of, for a lot of people, incomprehensible to think about how to break the powerful party system that we have today. And a lot of people just kind of give up on the possibility of it at all. Does that make sense? They're just so ingrained. They've wormed their way into the system so powerfully that it's hard to pull them back out. It's even hard to discipline them. Does that make sense? So there's that. So just because you have a vote doesn't mean that you're living in a really good functioning democracy like the Romans. The Romans celebrated themselves as like the best government ever because they had this democratic vote. But they're so heavily corrupted from within that a lot of them start saying, well, the vote doesn't really matter. The vote is predictable. We know who's going to win before Election Day, so why bother? Sound familiar?
Yes.
Yeah. So, yeah. And these problems obviously continue in a lot of ways. But questions at all about the patronage system? Does that make sense to you?
What happened if you didn't vote? Like you didn't vote?
You could be punished. Because the family wants your vote. Because your vote determines who wins elections. So staying home, not voting, isn't really an option. They give you a piece of paper and say, here's who you're voting for. Yeah? And it's that level of intimidation. Okay. Now going to their foreign policy in these wars and how they're going to expand territorially. So this one is an earlier map that when we saw when the Etruscans and the Greeks were extremely powerful in Italy. Their power is falling by the 200s especially. So the Latins have an opportunity. What historians and kind of foreign policy thinkers and whatnot, they call this a vacuum of power. When two groups have kind of dominated an area and they fight each other so much that they're both kind of letting go of their control, that creates an opportunity of power vacuum in the area. Does that make sense? And this has happened many, many times throughout human history. A third group who kind of stayed out, it just kind of takes advantage of that new opportunity, that open space. And the Romans will start to do this. So first their policy is just trying to survive this gigantic series of wars between the Etruscans and the Greeks. And one of their policies for survival is to sign up other Greek cities into a federation of Italian cities for their mutual self-defense. So the Roman Federation becomes a famous thing, especially by the 300s. Joining the Federation is not always voluntary. Some cities do sign up. They choose to do this because Rome is the kind of rising power of Italy. The Etruscans and the Greeks have been kind of knocked backward. They've been smacked down a little bit, or quite a lot. So some cities look at Rome as the new kind of guarantor of safety and stability. So they sign up with Rome by choice. The deal that the Romans offer is pretty basic. If you sign up with our federation, you can keep your own city government, you can keep your society and your culture and your own laws. All we ask is that you contribute soldiers to the Federation army and you pay some money into the kind of multi-city fund for defense. Does that make sense? So you can still govern your place and do your own thing. We just need soldiers and money from you every year, which is pretty reasonable. As the Federation grows, the Romans don't really want to negotiate so much anymore with other cities. There's a demand that cities join. And some cities that don't want to join get attacked, and they get forced into the alliance. So the Federation kind of evolves into a Roman-dominated empire into the 200s. Does that make sense? And it is growing, especially in the 200s, to really start dominating virtually all of mainland Italy as we know it today, south of the Etruscan areas especially. So questions about the Federation at all, or what it's doing, or how it's growing?
So at this point, it's not only Italy, but also Spain and...
No, not. Ignore all that for now. I couldn't find a better map of the Federation, so I just used this one. But it's in mainland Italy, almost totally, completely. They're not expanding further beyond that yet. All right. So in the 200s, the Greeks have largely kind of been kicked out of mainland Italy, and the Greeks' last big stand is at Sicily, this island just south of mainland Italy and right in the middle, smack in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. And the Greeks are still fighting with other peoples all over the place because they're an empire. They have colonies all over the place. And some of these colonies become independent cities and start governing themselves and break away from their Greek city sponsor. And one of these is called Carthage. And Carthage creates their own empire that they call the Phoenician Empire. So you'll see the term Phoenicians or Carthage or Carthaginians in different textbooks, but it's all the same government based in Carthage in North Africa. And they are right across the waterway from Sicily, which is where the Greeks are still based. And they start fighting each other. And they get involved in this giant war, and it's pretty chaotic. The people living in Sicily get sick of it, and they don't want the Greeks around anymore. They want to kick the Greeks out to stop all these wars. So a lot of the native people in Sicily start like an independence movement to break away from the Greeks. And they ask the Roman Federation for help. And the Romans agree. So this turns into a war of the Romans invade Sicily, they knock the Greeks out, but the Romans get sucked into this war against Carthage, which becomes known as the Punic War. So the Romans have taken over Sicily, and Carthage doesn't like that. Carthage feels threatened, so a war breaks out between the Roman Federation and Carthage.
Doesn't Carthage have like a senate too?
I've never studied the details of their government, so I think they have a monarchy, but I'm hesitant to even say that much.
I think they have a senate.
And the Punic War, you can see, goes on for a long time. 25 years is a long time, but
So were the
yeah. Question.
Carthage people fighting the Romans or the Greeks?
They're
prior
fighting
to the Roman invasion?
Oh, really both, but the Greeks are kind of withdrawing. So the Romans take over Sicily and make Rome into a possible enemy for Carthage, and that's how this whole thing breaks out. Yeah. Does that make sense?
And they're in what country? Now modern day Egypt or Libya or...
Let's see. No, it's not Tunisia.
No.
Tunisia's way up
the
there.
Morocco.
I think it's Morocco.
And they're originally Greek colonies, right?
Originally, but eventually they break away and later on, North Africa will be conquered by different European governments for a long, 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 long time, really up until World War II and even beyond.
80s.
Yeah, the French
Nigeria.
will try to control these areas right here along the northern African coastline, even to the 1950s, 1960s. That's why if you kind of go to that place today, it's a giant mixture of kind of African culture, Middle Eastern culture, as people kind of Muslims immigrated along the coastline, and European culture. So there's a lot of kind of interesting like fusion music and food and all kinds of things going on in this North African coastline. But there's also been a long history of violence, uprisings, and oppression.
Yeah, just didn't the Moors push that way all the way to Spain or whatever?
With Rome, yeah, we'll eventually get there. It takes a long time, but the Romans eventually gained the upper hand. Basically, the Romans had a big land army. Carthage had a big navy. So just like the Peloponnesian Wars with the Greeks, they can't really get at each other in a big battle for one side to just outright win. So it goes on for a long time. Eventually, the Romans figure it out. So they start building a big enough navy to actually invade and try to conquer Carthage. And that scares the Carthaginian leaders. And they ask for a peace treaty. And the peace treaty is pretty dramatic. The treaty gives all of Sicily to the Romans. So the Carthaginians say, you can just have it. Carthage tries to keep power by dominating these other two islands, Sardinia and Corsica, and largely by moving their armies and going around this kind of little connection here from North Africa just across the sea into modern-day Spain. So they'll send their armies, instead of eastward to dominate all these islands, they're going to send them west to get into what was back then called kind of Gaul, or even southern Gaul, to try to take over land in what is today modern-day Spain and southern Portugal. To try to gain enough land to rebuild their tax base and rebuild their economy and rebuild their empire, and maybe at some point in the future attack the Romans again when they're stronger. Does that make sense?
Is that when Hannibal came? Is this now?
Not yet. Well, this is when Hannibal is up and coming, right? And he comes from a military family, so he has access to... Hannibal's a big general in the Carthaginian army. But yeah, Hannibal's going to be based out here in what is today on this map called Spain, Iberia. A lot of ancient maps will call this the Iberian Peninsula, what is today Spain and Portugal. Does that make sense? The Romans understand that this is going on, and it's pretty obvious. So the Romans are afraid that Carthage is going to build up so much power that it'll attack Rome someday. So the Romans start a controversy where the Romans demand control over especially Sardinia, because they know that the Carthaginians will never accept that, and that will start a war. The Romans basically want to start a war before the Carthaginians can rebuild themselves. Does that make sense? Attack your enemy when they're still weak. So the Romans really they make demands that will start what becomes known as the Second Punic War. And this one will go on for 16 years or so. And let's see. Yeah. So here's Hannibal. He is a Carthaginian general out here in Iberia. That's where he and his big army are, his land army. So when the war starts, Carthage has a strategy. Let's just take this giant army we have out here in Iberia and send them to Rome and attack Rome, and that's how we're going to win the war. And Hannibal gets his orders, and he's very happy to do so. The Romans had killed his father, so he vows vengeance on Rome. He wants to burn Rome down as revenge. So he loves this idea, and he starts marching with his army toward Rome out of Iberia. The Romans hear about this, so they build up their own land army, and send them out to stop Hannibal. And Hannibal does a fairly smart thing at this point. Hannibal knows where he is. He has good maps. The Romans are kind of marching in areas they're not familiar with. So Hannibal kind of marches straight at them, and it just kind of goes around. And the Romans keep marching forward. So Hannibal just kind of whoop, whoop, goes around them and avoids them. And the Romans keep marching forward and forward and forward before they know what's going on. They're way behind Hannibal, and Hannibal is still moving toward Rome. Does that make sense? And they know there's no way they can catch up. So they send the messages by boat back to Rome. We screwed up. Send another army out to stop Hannibal. So the Romans build another army, send it out to attack Hannibal, and a battle happens. Hannibal wins. So he continues his march on Rome. The Romans panic, build another army, send it out to fight Hannibal. There's another battle. Hannibal wins. So Hannibal eventually gets down into northern Italy and will fight a lot of battles in Italy over the next 12 years or so. His dream is to get to Rome and conquer the city and burn it to the ground. That's his kind of fantasy. The Romans keep building one army after another to send it out to fight him, and over a decade, and he wins every single battle. So he seems invincible. Does that make sense? Hannibal's problem is that he is so far away from his supply lines that he can't get big reinforcements from Carthage. His troops have to forage, which means they basically steal food off of Italian farms for themselves to survive, to eat. So his big strategy, he doesn't have enough soldiers to attack Rome directly, and he knows it. So his idea becomes, I'll go to these other Italian cities that hate the Romans because they feel oppressed. They're forced into this federation. Does that make sense? And he'll make them an offer. Why don't you change sides, join my army, we'll all attack Rome together, we'll all burn down Rome, and then I'll just leave Italy, that's all I want to do, and your city will be free to do whatever it wants. Does it make sense? And he always expects the Italian cities to actually join him. But none do. And why is that?
Different culture? I mean, do you speak Latin?
Well, they speak different languages and whatnot. They have different cultures, but that doesn't stop people who have like the same interest, right?
Right.
If you both have a similar goal, if you have the same enemy, let's all go kill that enemy, and then we'll all be happy. So it's not really a language difference. They can find translators and whatnot. Any other ideas?
Because they know Rome's going to win.
Yeah, they're afraid of the Roman Empire. They're afraid of... they think that making a deal with Hannibal is risky, because what if Hannibal loses? If we join Hannibal and we lose, and the Romans win, the Romans are going to be so pissed off, they're going to come to our city and just massacre everybody. So yeah, they'll cheer for Hannibal, but it's too risky to join him. Does it make sense? They'll only join him when they think that they have an overwhelming chance of victory.
A lot of people in the north joined him, didn't they?
Well, a few groups join him, but most of the Italians are just way too scared of Roman vengeance, Roman revenge, to take the risk. So it's like patronage over all of Italy, right? You don't want to leave the family because it's like the boss is nuts, and he's going to take you out and your whole family, and there's going to be hell to pay if you question the authority. Does that make sense? Yeah. So Hannibal is running around in Italy year after year trying to convince the Italians to join him, and they really don't. Hannibal keeps winning battles against the Roman armies in Italy. They can't really stop him, but he doesn't have the strength to invade Rome itself, the city. And the Romans at this point decide they hit upon their old good idea, let's build up a big navy and attack Carthage directly, which they will do in 204. So they start building this navy with 35,000 troops. And the Romans will land their navy and unload their troops at the coastline just south of Carthage. And at that point, the government in Carthage panics. They say, our homeland's being invaded. We need our great general to come back home and defend the city. So they send a message to Hannibal, come back to Carthage. We need you here. And Hannibal and his leaders, they come back to Carthage. He gets an emergency Carthaginian army of about 50,000. And he goes out to take on the Roman invasion. The Romans have about 35,000 troops. So these are big, big armies for ancient times. And the battle hits at this place called Zama, just south of Carthage. And the Romans win. And it's the first time they beat Hannibal. And they win overwhelmingly. The Hannibal's army takes something like 20,000 deaths on the battlefield, and virtually all the rest either surrender or they run away. They flee the battlefield. So his army doesn't just kind of lose a battle, but they are just absolutely crushed. And Hannibal himself runs away trying to escape and survive. It doesn't work out too well for him. But at that point, the government of Carthage, they have no other option. They have to surrender. Does that make sense? So that's how the Second Punic War ends in 202. And the Romans, as punishment, take over all of the Carthaginian Empire. They take over those two islands, Corsica, the northern one, and Sardinia, the southern one. And the Romans take over the whole Iberian Peninsula from the Carthaginians, or as much as Carthage had conquered by that point. So this is becoming the Roman Empire, piece by piece. And in the peace treaty, Carthage has to sink its navy, has to destroy its warboats, its warships, so that Carthage can never threaten Rome again. Does that make sense? So the Romans are enriching themselves through war. They're conquering places, which is, a bunch of cheap land that's suddenly going to be for sale. So it's a real estate boom for the Romans. The problem that emerges at the end of the Second War is that a lot of the Greek cities got really worried when Carthage started losing the war against Rome, because the Greeks don't want to see the Romans rise in power, because that could threaten the Greeks. So the Greeks signed an alliance with the Carthaginians, or the Phoenicians, same people, in order to help Carthage survive. But now that Carthage has surrendered, now the Greeks are left to fight Rome all by themselves. Does that make sense?
Where were they the whole time, this whole Punic War?
Where were the Greeks?
Yeah, if they're allies.
Well, they're building up their armies. The Greeks don't have nearly as much real military strength as they think they do. So this is a giant miscalculation for them.
Didn't they have a strong navy, though?
Some cities have some boats, but remember, the Greek cities are always arguing against each other, right? They've been doing this for thousands of years. And the Romans have a pretty unified, gigantic amount of land in comparison. So not all the Greek cities go to war against Rome. A lot of them do, though.
Right now, they're trying to expand just to expand, or like resources and money.
Who is they?
The Romans.
Yeah.
Because you said at first they expanded because they didn't have like a lot of
Yeah.
natural resources.
A lot of historians argue that the Second Punic War is really a land grab by the Romans. They see a weak enemy that has a lot of land, and let's just take it from them. Let's come up with an excuse to start a war. It turned bad for Rome for a while, with Hannibal running rampant up and down Italy, just burning stuff to the ground and stealing everything he could get his hands on. But eventually the Romans figure out how to beat him. So right at the point where the Carthaginians get a peace treaty, Rome declares war against a whole bunch of the Greek cities and starts launching invasions, which become successful. The Greek cities, they're just beaten one after another. And the Romans actually conquer a bunch of Greece. But the Romans figure, we don't even need to try to control this place. Let's just give it back to the Greek leaders, city by city, because they've been fighting each other for thousands of years. They're nuts. They're chaotic. So just give it back to the Greeks and just let them fight each other for the rest of history. Does that make sense? Because they'll fight each other so much they can never threaten us. So the Romans at first, they don't even want to conquer Greece. Just give it back to the Greeks and let them go back to their madness. The Greek armies have to keep coming back to Greece when some Greek cities threaten to go to war against Rome, which is a really bad idea. Corinth is one city that constantly threatens Rome, which is ridiculous because Corinth is this big, just this little dot on the map in Greece, and Rome is now all of Italy. Does that make sense? Plus other islands and a bunch of Iberia. So for one city to think they can threaten Italy is pretty ridiculous. So Corinth becomes like the big symbolic Greek city that always wants to stand up to Rome. So when the Romans invade again into Greece, they specifically target Corinth for destruction, and they invade Corinth and burn it to the ground and massacre all of its people. As an example to the other Greeks, the other Greek cities. Don't mess with us. We're sick of this. Does that make sense? So they make an example out of Corinth, and it's a brutal, horrific, bloody example. At this point, Carthage somehow, and I've never been able to really understand this fully, even though the Romans are running rampant through Greece, doing whatever they want, Carthage thinks that Rome is distracted. Rome has its armies in Greece right now. So Carthage says, let's start a war against Rome, and we have an opportunity to attack. And this becomes the Third Punic War. Which is an unbelievable miscalculation. Carthage doesn't have a navy to attack with, and they're going to try to attack suddenly against Rome, which it just doesn't work on any level. So you see that this Third Punic War is much shorter than the first two, than either of the first two, because the Romans destroyed the Carthaginian army quickly and then went to Carthage. And the Roman decision at this point is to annihilate Carthage. Again, as an example to any possible enemies out there, don't mess with us. So the Romans inflict what historians have since called the Carthaginian Peace, which means they invade the city, they burn it to the ground, they kill all of the men in the city, they sell all the women and children into slavery throughout the Roman Empire and really anywhere else where someone's willing to buy slaves. They don't just burn the buildings, they dismantle the buildings. A lot of these buildings in the ancient world are built out of stone. So, starting fires doesn't really completely take them out. So they disassemble. They take up the buildings apart, stone by stone, brick by brick. And they're not even done there. They go out to the farmland around the city and dig up all the crops, all the food that was growing. And then they pour salt into the ground, into the soil. And what does that do?
It throws the pH levels of the soil off so nothing can grow.
Yeah, it destroys the soil. Yeah, chemically. So they annihilate the population. They destroy any remnant of buildings, burn the whole place to the ground, and then make sure food won't grow there for a few generations. This is genocidal. This is trying to wipe a whole city out of existence. to the point that no one will ever remember it was ever there. So that's what the Carthaginian peace means. It means we will have peace through the absolute annihilation of the enemy. Does it make sense? And they take over parts of North Africa that Carthage had control over. They largely give it back to other North African groups that kind of self-govern because the Romans don't really care about it so much. But I want to go back to the original map that we started off with, about an hour ago or so, where the Latins were just one small group in kind of central western Italy as we know it today. And they were so weak and small that they had to sit on the sidelines as the Etruscans and the Greeks fought it out. And step by step, to this map, the Romans by this point have conquered everything in red. And this is their empire. So through their federation, they gradually took over Italy itself. And then through the first war against Carthage, took over Sicily. The second war took over the neighboring two islands, Corsica in the north, Sardinia in the south, and Iberia. And in the second and third war, took over big chunks of Greece. And in the third war, took the rest of Carthage. So the Roman government was originally built to run a city, but now they have to run an empire. Many cities, many cultures, many languages. And that's the central problem they're going to run into in the future is, can a government that was intended to only just run this little city, is it efficient and strong enough to run this, what is becoming a far-flung empire all around the Mediterranean Sea, and keep control over all these territories?